My name is Evelyn Hayes. I am 71 years old, and my life has been a long, quiet, and deeply intimate conversation with the past. For 45 years, I was a book and paper conservator at the city's main historical archive. It is a profession of immense and almost invisible patience. My world was one of hushed, climate-controlled rooms, of the faint, almost sweet scent of decaying paper, of the delicate and deeply respectful art of mending the wounds of time. I did not just fix torn pages, I stabilized history. I took the faded, water-stained, and foxed records of human existence, letters, maps, diaries, first editions, and, with a knowledge of chemistry, of history, and of the very soul of paper itself, I made them whole again. It is a quiet, meticulous, and deeply honorable art. It is the art of ensuring that a story once told is never truly lost. My late husband, Robert, was a man who understood the profound and sacred nature of this work. He was a professor of medieval history, a man who believed that a book was not an object, but a vessel that carried the thoughts, the dreams, the very DNA of the past into the future. Our life together was a shared curatorship. We were the guardians of our own, small but deeply cherished, archive. Our home was the physical embodiment of this shared passion. It was a large, slightly rambling, and deeply comfortable arts and crafts-style house, a house we had bought as young and deeply impractical academics and had spent a lifetime filling with our treasures. It was not a house of expensive new things. It was a house of stories. The walls were not painted in fashionable shades of gray. They were lined, from floor to ceiling, with books. First edition copies of books Robert had taught, leather-bound volumes of poetry I had inherited from my father, and the thousands of books we had simply and joyfully collected together. The furniture was old and solid and comfortable, each piece a story in itself. It was a home built not on a foundation of concrete, but of shared history, of a deep and abiding love. Our only son, Arthur, grew up in this house, but he never truly inhabited its spirit. He was a boy, and then a man, who was always slightly embarrassed by its gentle, scholarly, and slightly dusty soul. He did not see the stories on the shelves. He saw the clutter. He did not feel the history in the worn, comfortable armchairs. He felt the shame of their not being new and sleek and modern. He was a man who loved his parents, I believe, but who was in a desperate and constant hurry to escape the quiet and deeply unfashionable story we had written for ourselves. He married Sophia, a woman who is the very antithesis of everything Robert and I ever stood for. She is an interior designer, a priestess of the minimalist, a woman who believes that a home is not a place to be filled with the messy and deeply personal artifacts of a life, but a space to be curated, a clean, white, and ultimately empty stage upon which to perform a life of modern and deeply aspirational perfection. She saw our beloved home not as a treasure, but as a teardown, a problem to be solved, a cluttered and deeply embarrassing past that needed to be erased to make way for her own, much sleeker future. My great sacrifice, the long, slow, and almost total surrender of my own quiet and deeply cherished world, began after Robert passed away. The house, which had once been a bustling two-person archive of a shared intellectual life, became a quiet, cavernous, and deeply, deeply lonely tomb. The silence was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on me day and night. And Arthur and Sophia, who were living in a small, stylish, and cripplingly expensive, rented apartment in the city, saw their opportunity. The conversations began slowly, a series of gentle and deeply manipulative suggestions. It started with my grief. "You shouldn't be alone in that big house, Mom," Arthur would say, his voice a perfect, soothing balm of filial concern. "It's not good for you, all those memories." Then it moved to the practical. "The upkeep on that place must be a nightmare," Sophia would chime in, her voice a sharp, clear, and deeply practical instrument. "The property taxes, the heating bills, The garden. It's too much for one person. They were not, of course, offering to help. They were offering a solution. Their solution. We've been thinking, Arthur said, one Sunday afternoon, as we sat in my garden. The garden Robert and I had spent a lifetime creating. What if we sold our place and moved in with you? We could help. We could take care of the house. We could take care of you. We could be a family again. I knew, in a cold, quiet, and deeply buried part of my soul, that it was a lie. But I was so lonely. The silence of the house had become a roaring in my ears, and the thought of it being filled with life again, with the sounds of my son, of my grandchildren, was a siren song I could not resist. And so, I agreed. I, the woman who had spent a lifetime preserving the integrity of fragile things, willingly, and with a foolish and deeply hopeful heart, agreed to allow the barbarians into the archive. The moving in was not a merging of two households. It was a conquest, a slow and deeply strategic colonization of my life. They did not sell their apartment. They simply put their things in storage, and they moved into my house, into the master bedroom, the room that had been mine and Robert's. I, in turn, moved into the small, quiet guest room at the back of the house. I was no longer the mistress of my own home. I was a tenant, a lodger, a quiet, and increasingly irrelevant curator of a museum that was in the process of being aggressively and unapologetically de-accessioned. The first things to go were the small things. The framed photographs of my life with Robert were deemed too cluttered for the new minimalist aesthetic, and they were, one by one, replaced with large, abstract, and utterly soulless pieces of modern art that Sophia had acquired. The comfortable, worn, chintz armchair in the living room, the chair where I had read stories to Arthur as a small boy, was moved to the basement, replaced by a sleek, white, and brutally uncomfortable leather sofa. But the real war, the slow and deeply, deeply personal war of attrition, was fought over the books. My books, Robert's books, our books, the 10,000 volumes that were the heart, the soul, and the very foundation of our home. To Sophia, they were not a library. They were a health hazard. "The dust, Eleanor," she would say, with a small, delicate, and utterly theatrical cough. "It's a nightmare for my allergies, and for the children's. A modern home should be clean. It should be a space for breathing." She began a campaign of quiet and relentless psychological warfare. She would suggest that I thin out the collection. She would leave articles on the kitchen counter about the benefits of decluttering. She would talk in front of me, to her friends on the phone, about the hoarding tendencies of the elderly. And Arthur, my son, my only child, the boy who had grown up in the beautiful and deeply magical forest of these books, said nothing. He would stand by, his face a mask of a pained and cowardly silence, as his wife systematically, and with a chilling and deeply personal glee, denigrated the very soul of his own and my life. I endured it. I retreated. I became a ghost in my own home, a silent and invisible archivist, watching as my own precious and irreplaceable collection was being prepared for the bonfire. I did it, I told myself, for peace. I did it, I told myself, for my grandchildren. I did not realize that my silence was not being interpreted as a desire for peace. It was being interpreted as weakness, as surrender, as the final, quiet, and deeply satisfying proof that I was, in fact, already gone. The slow, grinding, and deeply personal process of my own erasure continued for another year. I became a master of the art of invisibility. I learned to move through my own house like a ghost, my footsteps silent on the old, creaking floorboards. I took my meals in my small, quiet room, avoiding the sleek, minimalist, and now deeply alien space of my own kitchen. I was a quiet and tolerated tenant in the museum of my own former life. The one, non-negotiable and sacred ritual I clung to, the last, tattered flag of my own identity, was my annual working vacation. For 20 years, since I had officially retired from the archive, I had spent 2 weeks every autumn attending a series of specialized book and paper conservation workshops. It was my pilgrimage, my time to reconnect with my own professional soul. It was a journey back to a world where I was not a mother, not a grandmother, not a cluttered old woman, but Dr. Evelyn Hayes, a respected expert in my field. It was, I now see, the one small act of self-preservation I had, almost unconsciously, maintained. This year, when I announced my plans, my son and his wife were not just supportive, they were enthusiastic. Too enthusiastic. "Oh, Mother, what a wonderful idea," Sophia had said, her voice a symphony of a bright and deeply, deeply false sincerity. "You so deserve a break, to get away from all this dust." She had gestured vaguely at the library, her tone implying that my books were not just a source of allergens, but a kind of moral failing. "We'll be fine here, Mom," Arthur had added, his own voice full of a palpable and deeply unnerving relief. "Don't you worry about a thing. Just go, relax, recharge your batteries." They were not encouraging me to go. They were pushing me out the door. But I, in my foolish and deeply ingrained desire to believe the best of my own and only child, chose to see it as kindness. I packed my bags, my heart full of a quiet and deeply pathetic gratitude. The 2 weeks I spent away were a balm to my wounded soul. I was in a world of people who spoke my language. We talked of paper achidity, of Japanese hinging techniques, of the beautiful and almost spiritual challenge of restoring a water-damaged 17th century manuscript. I was not a ghost. I was a person. I was a professional. And for a brief and beautiful 14 days, I remembered who I was. I returned on a Sunday evening. The taxi dropped me at the end of my long, familiar driveway. I was tired, but in the way that a good day's work makes you tired. My mind was full of new ideas, my hands eager to get back to my own, small and deeply missed, conservation studio in the basement. I walked up the stone path, my small wheeled suitcase rattling behind me, my heart full of a quiet and deeply foolish sense of anticipation. I was, for the last time in my life, coming home. The first sign that the world had tilted on its axis was the front door. My key, the heavy, old, and beautifully ornate brass key that had opened this door for 50 years, did not fit in the lock. It slid in, and then met a hard, unyielding, and metallic resistance. The lock had been changed. For a moment, I felt nothing but a cold and deeply confusing blankness. A mistake. It had to be a mistake. I tried again. Nothing. I rang the doorbell. I could hear the familiar, melodic chime echoing from within the house, a sound that was, at once, both welcoming and deeply, deeply mocking. I waited. No one came. I rang again. And again. The house remained dark. Silent. Empty. A cold, sick, and deeply terrifying dread began to creep up my spine. I walked, my footsteps now loud and alien on the familiar stone path, around to the side of the house, to the porch that led into the kitchen. And that is where I found it. My life. My entire and beautifully cluttered and deeply, deeply personal life. It was all there, piled in a neat and brutally efficient stack against the side of the house. My clothes, in a series of black, plastic trash bags. My books, the few, precious and deeply personal, volumes I had kept in my own, small room, were in a series of cardboard boxes, the flaps unsealed, the contents exposed to the damp evening air. My tools, my beautiful and expensive and irreplaceable conservation tools, were tossed into a box with a careless and deeply insulting haste. And on the very top of the pile, like a final and desecrating cherry on a cake of pure, unadulterated cruelty, was the small silver-framed photograph of my late husband, its glass cracked. I stood there, in the cold and gathering darkness, and I looked at the wreckage of my own, small and fiercely loved, world. And I felt a pain so profound, so absolute, that it was beyond tears. It was a silent and soul-destroying scream. And then I saw the note. It was a single, white, business-sized envelope affixed to the front door with a single, brutal piece of clear plastic packing tape. It was not addressed. It did not need to be. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely tear it open. The note inside was not a letter. It was a pronouncement, a verdict, a final and deeply, deeply cowardly act of erasure. It was in my son's familiar and now monstrous handwriting. It was not a long note. It was, in fact, a masterpiece of a cold and brutal and deeply, deeply efficient brevity. It read, "Sorry, Mom. Sophia and I have decided to start our own life in our own home. We've had the locks changed. As you can see, we've packed your things. There's just no space for you here anymore. No space for you." The words. The simple and utterly and completely soul-annihilating words. I was not a person. I was a piece of furniture. A cluttered and inconvenient and deeply, deeply unfashionable piece of furniture that they had finally, and with a great and palpable sense of relief, decluttered from their beautiful and minimalist, and now, finally, and completely empty lives. The loving and deeply, deeply foolish mother died on that porch. The trusting and gentle and naive widow was gone. They had been evicted in the most brutal and public way possible. And in their place, a new woman was born. A woman I did not know. She was not a mother. She was not a victim. She was a curator, the sole and rightful curator of the Robert Hayes archive. And she was a woman who had just discovered that the most precious and valuable items in her collection had just been threatened by a pair of ignorant and deeply, deeply destructive barbarians. And the curator, I discovered, was a woman of a pure and cold and absolutely, unshakably righteous fury. I did not collapse on the porch. I did not weep over the cracked photograph of my dead husband. The shock, the grief, the humiliation, it was a fire, but it did not consume me. It forged me. In the cold and gathering darkness of that evening, the soft and pliable clay of the mother and the wife was fired into the hard and unbreakable porcelain of the woman I was about to become. My first act was not one of emotion. It was one of pure and practical conservation. My life's work had taught me that the first and most critical step in any crisis is to stabilize the artifact. And I and my life's possessions were now a deeply and dangerously unstable artifact. I took out my phone. I did not call my son. I did not call a friend. I called a taxi. And then I called a 24-hour emergency, climate-controlled storage facility. For the next 2 hours, under the cold and deeply indifferent light of the porch lamp, I worked. I was not a heartbroken old woman. I was a conservator, performing an emergency evacuation of a compromised collection. I loaded the boxes, the bags, the pathetic and deeply symbolic wreckage of my own life into the back of the taxi, and then into the clean, dry, and anonymous safety of a 10 by 10 storage unit. My final act, before I left my own and former home for the last time, was to retrieve one single item. I walked to the small hidden loose stone at the base of the old oak tree in the garden, a secret place that only I and my late husband had known about. And I retrieved the spare key to the house's original and now useless locks. It was a small and now completely symbolic object, a key to a life that no longer existed. I checked into a small, clean, anonymous hotel near the airport, and in the quiet and sterile and deeply, deeply lonely silence of that room, I finally and completely fell apart. The grief, the rage, the shame, it came in a great and terrible and cleansing flood. I mourned not just for my own broken heart. I mourned for the son I had lost, the boy who had been eaten alive by the monster of his own and his wife's ambition. But as the dawn broke, the storm of grief had passed, and in its wake it left the cold and beautiful and deeply, deeply clarifying light of a new and terrible purpose. The time for grieving was over. The time for research, for the slow and patient and deeply satisfying work of a curator preparing her case, was about to begin. My mind, the mind of a woman who had spent a lifetime studying the fine print, of analyzing the provenance of a document, turned to the one, last, and most important document of all, my husband's will. Robert, my wise and quiet and deeply, deeply prescient husband, had known. He had seen the fault lines in our son's character. He had seen the rapacious and deeply acquisitive nature of our daughter-in-law. And he, a man who had spent his life in the quiet and powerful world of trusts and estates, had built a fortress. A beautiful and elegant and utterly and completely unbreakable fortress of paper and ink. Our will was not a simple document. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of legal and protective architecture. It was a residency and curatorship trust. And I, with a sudden and thrilling jolt of a memory that was as clear and as bright as a flash of lightning, remembered the day we had signed it. "This is a bit unusual, Robert," our lawyer, a man named Henderson, had said. "A curatorship trust for a private residence? My wife is a curator?" Henderson, my husband, had replied, a small, quiet, and deeply amused smile on his face. "Her life's work is in that house. It is not just a piece of real estate. It is a collection, and a collection requires a curator. In perpetuity." The terms of the trust, I now remembered with a beautiful and deeply, deeply satisfying clarity, were simple, and they were absolute. The house and all its contents, the library, the art, the furniture, the very soul of our life together, were placed in the trust. I, Evelyn Hayes, was named the sole and lifetime curator. Were placed in the trust. I, Evelyn Hayes, and I was granted, by the legally binding and utterly irrevocable terms of the trust, the absolute and unconditional right of residency in that house. For the rest of my natural life, Arthur and Sophia were named as beneficiary residents. Their right to live in the house was a gift, a privilege, and it was contingent. It was contingent upon one simple and now beautifully and fatally violated condition. The condition was that they must, at all times, respect and in no way impede the curator's rights of residency and her duties of collection management. They had not just thrown me out. They had not just changed the locks. They had, in their arrogance, in their ignorance, and in their greed, just taken a metaphorical sledgehammer to the single, most important, load-bearing wall of the very legal structure that gave them a roof over their heads. They had breached the contract, and in doing so, they had just handed me, the curator, the legal and moral, and deeply, deeply satisfying authority to do what a curator does when a collection is threatened by a pair of destructive and deeply, deeply ignorant barbarians. She evicts them. My first phone call the next morning was not to my son. It was to Mr. Henderson. "Henderson," I said, and my voice was not the voice of the grieving broken widow he had last spoken to. It was the voice of the curator, the voice of the chairwoman of the Board of Trustees. "It is Evelyn Hayes. A breach of contract has occurred. A profound one. I am invoking the default and eviction clause of the Robert Hayes Curatorship Trust. I need you to draw up the papers. Immediately." There was a long and deeply, deeply satisfied silence on the other end of the line. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice a low, rumbling, and deeply pleased chuckle, "I have to hand it to Robert." The man was a poet, a legal and deeply, deeply prescient poet. "I will have the eviction notice and a locksmith at your Tithy house by noon. The plan was not one of revenge. It was one of simple and beautiful contract enforcement. It was a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying act of archival restoration. I was not destroying their lives. I was simply and quietly and legally refiling them under the correct and appropriate heading, former residents. I did not go to the house myself. I did not need to. The law, the beautiful and impersonal and utterly and completely unbiased machinery of the law would do the work for me. I can only imagine the scene. I can picture them in my house, my beautiful and now stolen house. I can see them drinking my coffee, sleeping in my bed, congratulating themselves on their clever and efficient and deeply, deeply cruel solution to their mother problem. And then I can see the doorbell ringing. I can see Arthur, my son, opening the door. And I can see the grim-faced and deeply unimpressed process server handing him the thick and deeply, deeply intimidating legal document. I can see their faces as they read the words. The beautiful and terrible and utterly and completely unbreakable words of my husband's final and most brilliant act of love. The words that informed them that they were not the owners, that they were not even the tenants, that they were, in fact, in breach of contract, and that they had, as per the terms of the trust they had never bothered to read, exactly 1 week to vacate the premises. The phone call came, of course, an hour later. It was not a call of confusion. It was a call of pure and unadulterated and deeply, deeply satisfying rage. "Mother, what have you done?" Arthur screamed, his voice a high-pitched and deeply, deeply pathetic squeal. "This is illegal. This is theft. We will fight you. We will sue you." "On what grounds, Arthur?" I asked, my voice the calm and deeply, deeply curious voice of a scholar engaging in a debate with a particularly and deeply, deeply stupid student. "On the grounds that you violated the terms of the very legal document that has been providing you with a free and very beautiful roof over your head for the past 3 years. I believe, and I am quite sure that Mr. Henderson and any judge in this state will agree, that it is you, my dear, who is in breach, not me." They were trapped. They were not just trapped by the law. They were trapped by their own, and their profound, and their deeply, deeply ignorant arrogance. They had built their entire, beautiful, and deeply, deeply fraudulent life on a foundation they had never bothered to inspect. And that foundation, it turned out, was a fortress. And I, the quiet and dusty and deeply, deeply underestimated old woman, was the one and only person who held the key. The week that followed the serving of the eviction notice was a masterclass in the slow, agonizing, and deeply satisfying anatomy of a collapse. It was not a loud, dramatic implosion. It was the quiet, inexorable, and deeply humiliating process of a faulty structure being condemned and dismantled, piece by painful piece. They tried to fight it, of course. Their lawyer, a man who was clearly out of his depth, made a series of frantic, blustering phone calls to Mr. Henderson. He spoke of emotional distress, of undue influence, of the unconscionable nature of the trust. Mr. Henderson, in his calm and deeply amused way, simply emailed him a single, scanned, and beautifully high-resolution copy of the trust document, with the single fatal signature page bearing both Arthur's and Sophia's names, highlighted in a cheerful and deeply ironic yellow. The legal challenges, as I knew they would, evaporated. They were left with nothing but the cold, hard, and deeply inconvenient reality of a legally binding contract they had breached. Their next strategy was emotional. My phone, which had been silent for so long, began to ring off the hook. It was Arthur. It was always Arthur. His calls were a pathetic and deeply predictable cycle of rage, of pleading, of a tearful and utterly insincere remorse. "How can you do this to your own son?" he would wail. To your grandchildren? This has nothing to do with my grandchildren, Arthur, I would reply, my voice the calm and steady and deeply unimpressed voice of a curator discussing an acquisition. They are, and always will be, welcome in my life. This has to do with you and with Sophia. This is a simple and unfortunate matter of contract enforcement. But it's our home, he would cry. No, Arthur, I would correct him with the gentle and relentless precision of a lexicographer. It was your residence. It has always been my home. There is a difference. I suggest you consult a dictionary. The final and most satisfying act of their collapse was the moving day. 1 week after the notice was served. I did not go to the house. I did not need to. I had Mr. Henderson and 2 very large and very unimpressed security guards there to supervise the deaccessioning. I sat in my quiet, anonymous hotel room, and I watched the entire proceeding on a live, private security camera feed that Henderson had set up on my laptop. I watched as they, under the calm and watchful eyes of the guards, packed their lives into cardboard boxes. I watched as the sleek, minimalist and soulless furniture they had bought to replace my own was hauled out of the house. I watched as Sophia, her face a mask of pure, ugly, and impotent rage, directed the movers with a series of sharp, angry gestures. And I watched my son. He did not look angry. He looked lost. A small and deeply, deeply pathetic little boy, standing in the ruins of a life he had not built, but had simply and arrogantly occupied. He had been the king of a castle he had not owned, and he had just been, in the most public and most humiliating way possible, evicted. As the moving truck, laden with the wreckage of their beautiful and deeply fraudulent life, pulled away from the curb, my son stood for a long moment on the empty porch of my house. He looked around, at the garden, at the old oak tree, at the life he had so carelessly and so completely thrown away. And then he did something that I did not expect. He looked directly at the small hidden security camera above the door, the camera he did not know I was watching through. And his face, for a moment, was not the face of the arrogant and cruel man he had become. It was the face of the small boy I remembered, a face of pure and heartbreaking and long, long overdue regret. And then he turned and he walked away, out of the frame and out of my life. My old life ended that day, with the quiet, grainy, and deeply unsatisfying image of my son's back disappearing down the driveway. My new life began the next morning with the glorious and deeply satisfying sound of my own old and beautiful brass key sliding into my own new and beautiful lock. The house was empty, and it was quiet. But it was not a sad quiet. It was a clean quiet, a quiet full of possibility, a quiet that smelled not of loss, but of liberation. I spent the first month not moving back in, but restoring. I was not just a homeowner. I was a conservator, and my home was my most precious and most damaged artifact. I hired a team of painters, and I had them paint over the cold, sterile gray walls of Sophia's regime, and I had them restored to the warm, creamy, and bookish white of my own. I went to the basement, and I retrieved my old, comfortable chintz armchair, and I placed it back in its rightful spot by the fire in the library. And then I began the most important restoration of all. The books. My beautiful, beloved, and long imprisoned books. I, with the help of a team of bright, young, and deeply reverent graduate students from my old university, began the monumental task of bringing the library back to life. We unpacked the boxes. We dusted each volume. And we placed them, one by one, back on the shelves in their correct and deeply satisfying Dewey Decimal System order. The house once again had a soul. It had a story. It had a past. And in that process, I found my future. I did not want to live in that grand, beautiful, and now quiet house alone. It was not a home for one person. It was a home for a community of ideas, a community of stories. And so I did not just move back in. I transformed it. With the help of my lawyer and my own, not inconsiderable financial resources, I established a foundation. The Robert Hayes Memorial Trust for the Preservation of the Written Word. The house, my house, is no longer a private residence. It is now the Hayes Center for the Study of the Book. It is a non-profit, residential, research library, a sanctuary for a select group of scholars, of writers, of conservators, of people who, like me, believe in the quiet and sacred power of the printed page. The grand, empty bedrooms are now quiet, beautiful, and light-filled studies for our resident fellows. The library is their laboratory. The garden is their sanctuary. And I am its first and its permanent curator in residence. I live in a small, beautiful, and light-filled apartment that we have built for me on the top floor, with a terrace that overlooks the garden. My life is no longer quiet, and it is no longer lonely. It is filled with the quiet and deeply satisfying hum of intellectual life. It is filled with the passionate and often brilliant conversations of my fellows. It is filled with the rustle of turning pages and the scent of old and beautiful and deeply, deeply treasured books. My son, I do not know what became of him. His story is no longer a part of my collection. I have deaccessioned him. And my own story, the one I am writing now, is a much, much better one. This evening, I am hosting a small dinner in the grand and now restored dining room. My guests are the 4 new Hayes Fellows, a young woman who is writing a biography of a forgotten female poet from the 19th century, a man who is creating a digital archive of endangered indigenous languages. We are drinking good, but not extravagant wine. And we are arguing, with a deep and joyful passion, about the future of the book in a digital age. I looked around the table, at their bright and passionate, and deeply, deeply intelligent faces, and I felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging that my own and biological family had never given me. My daughter-in-law, in her ignorance and in her cruelty, had tried to throw away my past. She tried to declutter my life. She did not understand. A life without its artifacts, without its stories, without its history, is not a clean and minimalist life. It is just an empty one. And my life, I am happy to report, is now, once again, gloriously and beautifully and wonderfully full.